Daniel Carter had learned to survive on 4 hours of sleep and a heart that refused to break, even when everything around him seemed determined to shatter it. If this story moves you even a little, stay until the end. And if you believe good people deserve a second chance, hit like and subscribe, because what happened to Daniel deserves to be heard by the whole world. It began on an ordinary Tuesday morning, the kind that looked no different from 100 mornings before it. Daniel stood in the small kitchen of his cramped apartment, buttoning a grey shirt that had seen better days, listening to the sound of his 6-year-old daughter, Lily, coughing softly in the next room. He closed his eyes for a moment, drew a slow breath, and reminded himself of the only thing that mattered. She needed him more than his job needed him on time. Lily had been diagnosed 8 months earlier. The word leukemia had crashed into their small world like a wrecking ball, splintering every plan Daniel had ever made for their future. Her mother had left when Lily was 2, unable to handle the weight of raising a child alone, and so it had always been just the two of them. Daniel and his little girl, a team of 2 against everything life could throw. When the diagnosis came, Daniel didn't cry in front of her. He smiled, held her hand, and promised her that they would fight this together, one appointment at a time. The treatments were early, always early. The hospital only had chemotherapy slots at 6:30 in the morning for patients on Lily's protocol, a full 2 hours before Daniel's shift began at Harman Logistics. For months he had worked out a fragile system. Drop Lily at the hospital, sit with her through the 4-line, wait until the nurse said she was stable enough to be walked to the family room, drive across town to drop her with his elderly neighbor, and then race to work, arriving 10, sometimes 15 minutes late. He never told anyone why. Not because he was ashamed, but because he could not bear to say the word one more time than he absolutely had to. Saying it to strangers made it more real, and some mornings, real was more than he could hold. His supervisor, a sharp-tempered man named Gary Reynolds, had noticed the pattern of late arrivals almost immediately. Reynolds ran the warehouse floor like a machine, and in his world, a machine that faltered got replaced. He pulled Daniel aside after the 3rd late morning and warned him, arms crossed, voice clipped, one more incident, and there would be consequences. Daniel nodded, apologized, and said nothing else. He couldn't explain that this wasn't carelessness. He couldn't explain that every minute he was late was a minute he'd spent holding his daughter's small hand while a needle found a vein that kept collapsing from months of treatment. He simply said, "It won't happen again," knowing full well that it probably would, because Lily's fight came first, and it always would. For a while he managed. He shaved seconds off every part of his routine. He skipped his own breakfast. He stopped shaving some mornings just to save the 2 minutes it cost him. He learned which traffic lights to avoid and which side streets shaved 90 seconds off his drive. But illness does not care about schedules, and some mornings Lily's blood counts were too low, her body too weak, and the nurses needed more time than Daniel had to give on those mornings. He arrived at the warehouse 20 minutes late, breathless, his eyes red-rimmed from a fear no parent should ever have to carry alone. And Reynolds would simply stare at him from across the loading dock, saying nothing, writing something down on his clipboard. The other employees noticed things too, in the way people always notice more than they say. They saw the hospital bracelet Daniel forgot to remove one morning. They saw him wince every time his phone buzzed, as if every notification might be the one that changed everything. They saw the way he had grown thinner over the months, his cheerful jokes fading into a quiet, focused silence. But no one asked. In a busy warehouse where everyone was chasing quotas and deadlines, kindness often got lost in the noise, and Daniel, fiercely private and unwilling to accept pity, never gave anyone the opening to ask. Then came the morning that changed everything. Lily had a seizure during her infusion, a rare but terrifying side effect the doctors had warned him about, but he'd never truly believed would happen to his daughter. Daniel stood frozen at her bedside as a team of nurses rushed in, as monitors screamed, as his entire world narrowed down to the rise and fall of his little girl's chest. He did not check his phone. He did not think about work. He held her hand and begged whatever might be listening to let her keep breathing. By the time the crisis passed and Lily was stabilized, sleeping peacefully with a nurse's reassurance that she would be fine, it was almost 10 in the morning. Daniel arrived at Harman Logistics nearly 3 hours late, His shirt still creased from the hospital chair, his eyes hollow, his hands trembling from adrenaline that had nowhere left to go. Gary Reynolds was waiting for him at the front desk, arms crossed, jaw tight. He didn't ask where Daniel had been. He didn't ask if everything was okay. He simply slid a folder across the counter and said the words that would haunt the entire office for weeks to come. "We're letting you go, Daniel, effective immediately." Daniel stood there in silence, feeling the floor tilt beneath him. He wanted to explain, wanted to say that his daughter had almost died 3 hours ago, that he'd been fighting a battle no manager's memo could ever prepare him for, but something inside him refused to beg. He had spent 8 months protecting Lily from having to see him break. He would not let this be the moment he finally did, not in front of people who had never once bothered to ask why. "Understood," he said quietly, and walked out with a small cardboard box someone handed him, containing nothing but a coffee mug and a photo of his daughter's smiling face. Word of the firing spread through the office before lunch, the way bad news always does. Some employees shrugged it off, assuming Daniel simply hadn't cared enough about his job. Others felt a flicker of unease, remembering the hospital bracelet, the trembling hands, the hollow look that had settled into his eyes over the past months. It was Maria Santos, a young woman from the shipping department who had once shared a lunch table with Daniel, who finally asked the question no one else had thought to ask out loud. Does anyone actually know why he was always late? That single question cracked something open. Maria began asking around, gently, carefully, and what she found broke her heart. A neighbor who occasionally helped watch Lily confirmed the hospital visits. A pharmacist down the street recognized Daniel's name and mentioned, without realizing the weight of what she was sharing, that she'd filled prescriptions for a young leukemia patient named Lily Carter for the better part of a year. Maria sat at her desk that afternoon, tears silently rolling down her face, piecing together the story of a father who had shown up to work exhausted, frightened, and utterly alone, never once asking anyone for sympathy or an exception. She brought what she'd learned to her co-workers, and then, unable to stay quiet, she brought it to Gary Reynolds himself. She stood in his office, voice shaking with anger and grief, and told him the truth, that the man he had fired without a single question was a single father who had spent the last 8 months waking before dawn to hold his dying daughter's hand through chemotherapy, who had never once complained, never once asked for special treatment, and who had been let go on the exact morning his daughter nearly died in front of him. Reynolds sat in stunned silence. He was not a cruel man by nature, only a tired, overworked manager who had let policy replace compassion, who had mistaken quiet suffering for carelessness. The weight of what he had done settled over him like a stone. He thought of his own children, of the mornings he would have moved heaven and earth for them, and he understood, with a shame that made his stomach turn, exactly what he had taken from a man who had nothing left to give but everything he had. By the next morning, the story had spread beyond the walls of Harmon Logistics. Maria had shared what she knew on a local community page, not naming names cruelly but simply asking the world a question: how many good people are punished every day because no one bothers to ask why? The post spread faster than anyone expected, shared by parents who understood the terror of a sick child, by workers who had felt invisible in their own struggles, by strangers moved to tears by the image of a father silently fighting a war no one else could see. Local news picked up the story within 2 days. Reporters wanted to speak to Daniel, but he refused every interview, wanting nothing but to be left alone with his daughter, who was, thankfully, recovering steadily, her latest scans showing the treatment was finally working. It was Reynolds who found him first, standing outside the small apartment building where Daniel lived, hat in his hands, unable to meet his former employee's eyes. He apologized, not the hollow corporate apology of someone protecting a company's image, but a real one, raw and stumbling, admitting that he had failed to see the man in front of him, that policy had blinded him to humanity, and that he was ashamed of the manager he had allowed himself to become. He told Daniel that his job was waiting for him, that the company would cover whatever medical costs insurance hadn't touched, and that from now on, his schedule would bend around whatever his daughter needed, without question, without hesitation. Daniel almost said no. Pride whispered that he didn't need this company, that he could find work elsewhere, somewhere that wouldn't have discarded him so easily in the first place. But then he thought of Lily, of the mounting bills, of the stability she needed during a fight that was far from over, and he swallowed his pride for her sake the way he always had. He returned to Harman Logistics 2 weeks later, not as a warehouse worker on an ordinary schedule, but as something new, a position the company created specifically to bridge the gap between employees and management. Someone whose job was to notice the things everyone else missed, to ask the questions no one else thought to ask. Gary Reynolds himself had proposed it, determined to ensure that no employee at Harman Logistics would ever again be judged before being understood. Lily's treatment continued, slow and difficult, but steady. Doctors spoke cautiously optimistic words about remission. Daniel kept a framed photo on his new desk. Lily, bald from chemotherapy but grinning fiercely at the camera, a paper crown from a hospital volunteer perched on her head, because even in her hardest days, that little girl had refused to stop smiling. Months later, Daniel stood at a podium during a company event meant to celebrate a new employee wellness initiative born from his story, his hands trembling not from fear this time, but from the sheer weight of gratitude. He looked out at a room full of people who now knew his truth, who had learned, because of his pain, to look a little closer at the people around them. He spoke only a few words, his voice thick with emotion. He told them that the world was full of people fighting silent battles, that a single moment of judgment could crush someone already standing at the edge, and that all it ever took to change a life was one person willing to ask why. He told them that he hadn't wanted pity, hadn't wanted headlines, hadn't wanted anything but the chance to keep fighting for his daughter without losing the ground beneath his feet. And he told them, finally, that Lily, his brave, brilliant, unbreakable little girl, had just celebrated 1 full year in remission. The room rose in applause, but Daniel barely heard it. His eyes were fixed on the doorway, where Lily stood in a small blue dress, hair beginning to grow back in soft dark curls, running toward her father with her arms wide open. He knelt down, caught her, and held her the way he had held her through every needle, every fever, every terrifying night in a hospital room that had once felt like the edge of the world. In that single embrace was everything the story had ever truly been about. Not a firing, not a fight for a job, but the unbreakable love of a father who had never once, not for a single second, considered giving up. And as he held his daughter close, Daniel finally allowed himself the one thing he had denied himself for 8 long months. He let himself cry, not from grief, but from a joy so overwhelming it could no longer be contained. Because sometimes, the people who seem to be failing are the ones fighting the hardest battles no one else can see. And sometimes, all it takes to change everything is one person brave enough to finally ask why.